Hey, welcome back. So in this lecture, we will continue the discussion on the UPROPERTY specifiers. I will scroll down. We have seen these examples. We have used these examples before. So I will start by doing something new here. I will comment these ones out that we used before. I will group these variables together. Hit points and armor, those relate to our health, our character health basically. Then we also have some damage that our character can potentially inflict, such as weapon damage or spell damage, something like that. I have these here because we can have different categories, and I will explain those later on here in the lecture. So I'll just start off by creating these variables. They are edit anywhere at the moment. Note that I've initialized these variables, so hit points to 100, armor to 0, weapon damage to 25, and spell damage to 5. We may want to get and set those in the blueprint graph in response to an event or something like that, such as begin play. We may want to get or set these values, print them out, for example, and so on. Before we build, we have to go to dummyactor.cpp. Remember, we have this statement right here. Those don't exist anymore. We have commented those out. So we want to make sure to comment this line out right here. Go back, and this should be fine. I will build and run. Alright, so an easy way to get to our dummy actors more quickly than we've done before is to create a folder maybe. But I'll just continue on here. I will open up the dummy actor blueprint. Now, because those are edit anywhere, they do show up in the details panel over here. They do show up under currently the dummy actor category, and the defaults that are set for those do show up, right? And if you modify that, we get the revert button again. But if I right click in the graph, let's say I want to use those variables in response to something. If I search for one of those variables, such as armor or hit points, they do not show up. And the same thing over here, if I click on this cog right here, this gear button, and I show inherited variables, we don't even get the dummy actor category. Our variables do not show up, so we cannot drag and drop those into our graph. So let's see how we can fix that. A quick summary on the blueprint specifiers. We have blueprint read only. The property can be read by blueprint, so in other words we can get a getter to that, but we cannot modify that. In other words, we do not have a setter for that property. We also have the blueprint read write specifier, which allows the property to be read or written from a blueprint. In other words, we can get a getter or a setter for that property in the blueprint graph. Now, these specifiers are incompatible. In other words, we will use one or the other, but not both. These are really handy because if we use those, we don't have to write custom getters and setters for those properties. Alright, this is where blueprint accessibility specifiers come in. First, we have basically the editor specifiers. So do we want the variables to be visible or editable in the details panels? But next, we want to make those available to the blueprint graphs. With the hit points, for example, let's say we want that to be readable in the blueprints. We start with a blueprint prefix, because again this relates to the blueprint accessibility. I will provide this blueprint read-only specifier. This particular specifier will provide us with a getter in the blueprint graph, so we can get that particular property, so in this case hit points, but we will not be granted a setter for the other properties. I'll just do these first two for now, so hit points and then armor. For hit points, I will specify blueprint read-only. Then for armor, I will specify the blueprint read-write. When we specify blueprint read-write, we should get a setter and also a getter node in the graph. I will save my changes. Back in the editor, we can recompile. Live coding succeeded. Now back in the blueprint editor for the dummy actor. Notice that we have the dummy actor category down here, and we have hit points and we have armor. If I drag out hit points into the graph and I let go, we can get a getter to that, so we can get hit points. But notice that we cannot do a setter for that, right? That is grayed out. But for armor, if I drag that in, we can do a getter and we can do a setter as well. Similarly, if I right click, we can actually navigate down to variables down here, And then we also have a category currently set to dummy actor, and we can get or set depending on how we have that set up in the C++ section. So we have get armor, get hit points, and set armor. Okay, so that is to demonstrate the difference between blueprint read-only and blueprint read-write. Blueprint read-only will provide us with a getter in the blueprint graph. Blueprint read-write will provide us with a getter and a setter in the blueprint graph. Next, as I mentioned, we can also provide a custom category. And we can do that by using the category specifier. We can assign a string to that specifier. So in this example, I will assign attributes to that category specifier. I will save my changes again, and then back in the editor, we can recompile once more. Back in the blueprint editor, in the My Blueprint tab, under the variable section, we have this attributes section now, this attributes category now. Similarly, in the class defaults, I can click this button for the class defaults, or I can click on the between parentheses, you will have self, so you can click on that. That will also bring up the class defaults. We'll close these down. And notice we have an attributes category now. Now we can actually create subcategories as well, so I will summarize that for you before we move on. A quick summary on the UPROPERTY category specifier. We can use the category specifier to categorize our properties and functions. So the category specifier will be used on UProperties and UFunctions. As you can see in this example, we can actually do a top category and then a subcategory. So we can define nested categories using the vertical bar operator. Alright, back in Visual Studio, I will set up categories and subcategories for these. For the health, for example, and for the armor. So we'll set that in a subcategory. Let's say health, for example. Okay, I'll provide some of those blueprint accessibility specifiers for our attacks now, and then also I will categorize those under attributes attacks so we can see the differences and how those show up. Once again, I will save my changes and then back in the editor. Remember that we have the hotkey Ctrl-Alt-F11 to recompile. Live coding succeeded. Now back in the My Blueprint tab in the variables subsection under attributes, we now have two subcategories. That is health and attacks. And again, for those we can get and we can set. Similarly, if I right click to get this context menu and I scroll down to variables, we also have subcategories. If we expand attributes, we also have the subcategory attacks and then health. Now, of course, we don't have any function set up yet. These are just variables at the moment. But here we can get the spell damage, for example, the weapon damage. We can set those and so on. This is just a quick high-level example, but you can start to imagine just how useful this will be when you have 100 member variables and member functions, for example, to have those categorized out like this. Similarly, under class defaults, we also have those categories now show up. Health and attacks subcategories, those will now show up under the attributes category. Similarly, that category will show up on a per instance basis in the level editor in the details panel. So for example, I select the C++ instance dummy actor. You can notice under attributes, we have the subcategories here. So the top category is attributes, and then we have the subcategories health and attacks. Those also show up here on a per instance basis. And what's great about this is we can search for those. So we can search for attributes, for example, or we can search for a subcategory such as health as well, and notice that the health category now comes up with the hit points and the armor. And of course the same thing in the blueprint editor where you want to search. So you can search over here, you can search in here as well, and those attributes will show up. Alright. Now with those blueprint accessibility specifiers set up the way we want, we can use those properties in our graphs in response to certain events. So event per gameplay, for example. Again, we can go to variables, attributes, and then we can drag things in. We can fetch the armor, for example. I can get the hit points, for example, and then I can print those hit points out, or I can set something. So I can do the armor, for example. I can set the armor to something like 75, hook those up. Just trying to get all of the stuff on the screen. So firstly, we will get and print the hit points. Then we will set the armor and we will print the armor. Compile and save. Play here in a new editor window. And as I mentioned, we get 75 and 100 printed out. 100 will print out first, and then we print out 75. The point with this demonstration is those blueprint accessibility specifiers will basically give us getters and setters without us having to create such functions ourselves. Press Alt and left click on that to disconnect that. Compile and save. Also, if you're not quite familiar with blueprints, I do recommend that you maybe take a course on that. Maybe watch my Unreal Engine Foundations module. Here, for example, we are doing a conversion between a float and a string. And over here, this is going to retrieve the value of the variable. So we can simply use this instead of doing a separate get node. Once we've set that, we don't have to do a separate get node. We can simply drag off of here, alright, as we are doing here. And once again, that will get converted to a string. One interesting example on how we can combine the UPROPERTY specifiers. In this example, we have UPROPERTY, and then the specifiers are visible anywhere, and then blueprint read write. So if you think about this for a second, the property is visible in all the property windows, that is in the details panels, but it cannot be edited. So we can see the defaults that are set for that in C++, but we cannot edit those in our blueprint derived classes. But the property can be read or written from a blueprint. So in other words, we can place down a getter node and a setter node for that particular property. And in other words, we can edit the property in the blueprint graph. And we can also read or get that property in the blueprint graph. So this is one interesting combination. Maybe you don't want to give the designer or the artist the ability to set the defaults, but you want to give them access to actually modify that in the blueprint graphs, maybe in reaction to certain gameplay effects and events. Alright, in this table I've outlined the steps that you will take to provide specifiers for your properties. So in the first step, we want to specify the editor accessibility. We should think in terms of a read-write, so in other words, visibility and editability. If we want the property to be read-only, then we can specify visible anywhere, visible defaults only, or visible instance only. Then if we want to read, or in other words write, then we can do edit anywhere, edit defaults only, and edit instance only. I've bolded the common ones here, visible anywhere and edit anywhere. Those are the ones that we will use for the most part. The other ones are more situational. For the most part, I don't really use the other ones because of some of the issues that we can run into, as I've demonstrated in that first lecture on the UPROPERTY. The next step is to specify the blueprint accessibility. Again, do we want the property to be available in the blueprint graph? Do we want to allow access for that to be fetched and then also to be written to? The read-only option is blueprint read-only, and then if we want to read and write, then we can provide a blueprint read-write. Finally, we can specify a category. I've demonstrated the UPROPERTY with a couple of specifiers in the final example there. Visible anywhere, blueprint read-only, and then the category is components, for example, or setup or something like that. This is typically the format that we will go with, and that you will see in Epic's provided examples as well. So this is what we will stick to. But of course, you can swap some of these around, such as visible anywhere and blueprint read-only. You can actually swap those around, and you should not have any issues. But again, we will stick to this format in this course. One way to think about this with the blueprint accessibility, we have the blueprint prefix. That blueprint prefix refers to the blueprint visual scripting, or in other words, the usage of those members or properties in blueprint logic. So if we want to specify the blueprint accessibility, we begin with blueprint, and then we specify, okay, we want that to be read-only, or we want that to be read-write. Okay, so that is one way of remembering that.